Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus. Brad, what's up, man? Appreciate the time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
So you wrote a pretty in-depth article last week about the GM candidates league-wide, and obviously we all expect Washington to have an opening, and that this is the first time I feel like in the last 30 years that they've had like a really good opening that someone's going to really want to take. Like the top candidates are going to be, you know, maybe when Dan Snyder first bought the team and people didn't realize how horrible he was, they could have attracted a top candidate, but certainly they have not been in the mix for the league's best and brightest on a coaching or certainly a front office front for a long time. So I also think that the structure becomes an interesting question as Rivera's kind of had this coach-centric. He's actually the president of football operations, in terms of the hierarchy. So before we even get into the candidates, like format-wise, what's working in the league right now in terms of power structures, and why do you think that's the case?
First, I would say in preparing this, I'm talking to some people that are, involved to a degree in these decisions or prospective candidates. And yes, it is. Some people said that it might be the most attractive opening of any this offseason. And yeah, you have not heard that about Washington in a very long time. So, different structures work for different clubs. Like there definitely is not a one size fits all. But I think when you do, look at some of the top organizations, your Philadelphia's, your San Francisco's, Baltimore, Cleveland, people wouldn't put in that bucket because they obviously had a ton of on-field success. But, I can tell you the league views them as an incubator for up-and-coming talent. There's a reason why, a guy like Equazio Fomensa becomes a GM elsewhere, even off a year they missed the playoffs. Like, Glenn Cook is a top candidate. A guy there now is assistant GM, Catherine Raish, et cetera. So anyway, I think that the key is you're bringing in and competing in the market for smart people that view the league and view the sport in different ways. Whether it's college scouting, pro scouting, quote unquote analytics, football administration, which is salary cap, contracts. It's really just about now understanding we're not going to be the MLB and have 60-person staffs that are doing, data science and research and whatnot, but just finding edge cases, uncovering more stones, and doing as much as possible to compete in those marketplaces. That's what the top teams are doing.
I think that's interesting because you say they're not going to have 60-person staffs. Josh Harris might be like, actually, we are. He's certainly the kind of guy that would do it. But I think larger, you touch on that there's so many different places that a GM could come from. They could have a football administration, a data science, a scouting background. Traditionally, they've been scouts. But as more technology and more information becomes available, obviously that has changed over the last decade in the league. Does it seem to matter where someone starts, or as long as you put together a good group that checks all those boxes somewhere underneath you, it works?
That's the thing. And so I think that, maybe the complaint at times with the top scout, quote unquote, general manager is that guy going to be the best leader of an organization, right? Where not saying they can't be, but you go from you're on the road, grinding the pavement, scouting, going to college games, going to campuses, doing all of those things, to then, hey, you're now the CEO of a big company, right? Like that's really what you are. You're having conversations about, hey, we have a new practice facility we're trying to break ground on in construction. We're doing this, that, the other. You're dealing with legal matters. You're dealing with things that never crossed your mind when you were, just a scout or a personnel, person. So that's the big thing, is I think that those guys still are certainly capable of doing that, but there are these ecosystems within teams where you have football operations people that are solely there to run that portion of the business and allow other people to stay in their silo and focus on their subject matter expertise. So no background's necessary. I think it just comes with the understanding of, like, for example, there are some candidates that are pure football people, quote unquote, who've now been given more responsibility in managing people beneath them and managing different departments, understanding different nuances of how to run a building, because without that experience, there are, teams are worried they're going to be overwhelmed by the other responsibilities that come with that top job.
Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus is with us here on the Hoffman Show. Again, talking about the potential GM job in Washington, or the future GM job in Washington. Seeing how Josh Harris has set up, I don't know how much you pay attention to either the NHL or the NBA. But I think we all, at the very least, paid attention enough, took a peek at what he'd done with the Sixers and the Devils when he bought the Commanders. Like, is there anything that you take from what he's done there that you think would inform any prediction you would make about what he would do here?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's not going to be complacent and is not going to, kind of follow a traditional method and traditional path. He's going to explore if there are inefficiencies within the NFL and that could be exploited, or there are just different ways of doing things. I don't know when he bought the Devils, but like Lou Lamoriello, who's one of the greater executives in NHL history, like has talked a bunch about the different things he would do to uncover talent in different countries and send people different places. So yeah, I do follow the other sports as well. NBA, obviously, we all know about Sam Hinkie and, trust the process and all of those things. And of course, now Daryl Morey with that background as a quote unquote analytics guy. And again, I think it comes back to the core of you need to know football, understand football, and identify football talent. This is a player-driven league and a player-driven sport, but how you get from point A to point B can be different. And then also just how you actually manage those assets and allocate your resources, I think, is the biggest issue in Washington. Actually, I think have been underratedly pretty good at scouting college players over the last 10, 15 years. It's just, then you're waiting too long to pay those guys. So you pay higher than you needed to, or you're putting all your resources, 4 straight first round picks in one positional unit. Like things of that nature are the bigger issue. I actually think they've been fine in just the actual scouting on a player to player basis.
Yeah, or asking a guy to do 17 jobs at once at linebacker when perhaps he wasn't even a first-round pick in the first place. Whoops, sorry, I said that one out loud. Brad Spielberger with us. By the way, just because you mentioned some of their recent draft success, and there is actually one guy that's not on your list that I would be curious about. What do you think of Kyle Smith in Atlanta? Because he was here for a long time, and I happen to think when he left that they should have just elevated him to GM instead of hiring Mayhew. And I think that was a very brief discussion at some point, but it was kind of like, no, he's too young. They've obviously drafted some tremendous players down there. They're in a weird spot with the quarterback situation, but is Kyle someone you consider putting in that article?
Good point. And I can tell you a lot of people agree with you and thought that's probably what should have happened in Washington. He's probably maybe needs to build up a little bit more groundswell and have a couple more years of success, but I do expect him to be at the forefront of those conversations at some point. I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about him, outside of just, like you said, we've seen the track record of success in identifying talent. Probably should be a name that should be more on my radar because, yeah, I have heard good things about him in the past, and I do think he will, like you said, quarterback's tough in Atlanta, but they had a pretty good offseason otherwise. They've drafted some quality players over the last couple of years, and of course, he plays a hand in doing so.
Yeah, definitely. I was always impressed with him when he was here, and I definitely think he'll be. It's funny because his dad obviously was a GM in the league, and there's always the nepotism thing, and it's like, no, I've talked to the guy; he's pretty sharp. All right. Speaking of guys who are pretty sharp, they seem to have about 78 of them in Philadelphia's front office. Obviously, Howie Roseman runs the show there, but you've got multiple names from Philadelphia on your list. If you could pick one of them to be your GM, whether it's in Washington or somewhere else, is there one that you think stands above the rest?
A good question, too. And the crazy thing is they also had 4 different people become assistant GMs in other buildings in one offseason. You mentioned, I think maybe it's pre-show about how, stealing someone from Philadelphia could be great for Washington, like Brandon Brown, who's now the Giants assistant GM, who was in Philadelphia. So, it's interesting. The people left there now, I think, do skew more of that, data, football administration or analytics, so to speak. I do think Alec Hallaby, who's now an assistant general manager, who has kind of spearheaded their data and research and strategy department, will be a general manager at some point in the near future. I don't know if it's this cycle. Just first year as an assistant GM. I think you do hear some things about in Philadelphia, maybe a lack of delegation because Howie has his hands in everything. And so I think that's why you see people maybe go to other buildings to be assistant GMs, get more responsibility, more power, and kind of just learn the nuances of what that looks like. So anyway, I think Alec will be a general manager. I think an interesting name, particularly here as it relates to the Commanders and a Josh Harris. So Jake Rosenberg is the number 2 football administration person beneath Howie Roseman because, he has a cat background. So Jake is the number 1 cap guy in Philly, but you can't be when your GM is Howie Roseman. So he's a guy that I think you could, if you wanted to do like a Paul DePodesta in Cleveland, not that he's an analytics guy, but if you wanted to have a president of football operations, here's a good comp, like a Rob Brzezinski in Minnesota, who runs a ton of, all of the salary cap and contract, but also the day-to-day in the building, and various different elements of just running the company, so to speak. I think Rosenberg's an interesting name because I wonder if he feels like there's kind of a cap on what he can do in Philadelphia. Maybe he probably wants to be a GM, but maybe is open to, hey, go the president route, run a building from a different standpoint, from a business standpoint, and maybe you can always pivot back, kind of like an Omar Khan in Pittsburgh, who now obviously is the general manager.
Yeah, there's so much interesting stuff there. And it's actually also sparked something that I was thinking about the other day. We were talking about some of the folks out in San Francisco. And I said to my producer when we were having this discussion off the air was, like San Francisco is a little less intriguing to me than, say, a Philadelphia, because I think Kyle is so smart and he's the most important person in the building that he can make, like, obviously they've done a tremendous job. This is not to take away if you can only do the job that's in front of you, but Kyle Shanahan can make you right on a lot of stuff. And Kyle knows exactly what he wants because he's so detail oriented. So as you think about like Howie having his hands in everything in Philadelphia or the way Kyle operates in San Francisco, I'm curious if that plays into your evaluation of these candidates and why I say, like Cleveland, you mentioned, doesn't necessarily make sense on paper. And obviously they gave Deshaun Watson the worst contract in the league, but I'm guessing the ownership has something to say about that. So like, as you evaluate the different front offices, how do some of the biggest impact players, Howie Roseman and Kyle Shanahan, impact those evaluations?
It's a great question. It's probably the hardest part of trying to do this is, actually trying to not isolate who gets credit, because everything usually is a group decision, but just, like kind of differentiate who is in charge of certain elements or certain components of what you're doing. Or even if you don't want to do that, but just say, like, is this a person that is viewed as someone who could be the top dog and run a building, or are they kind of better served as a lieutenant working underneath a powerful top guy? So that comes from conversations and just talking to people and hearing the perception of people around the league. I think the thing with Philly, as much as I have heard, like, how he is so involved and so on top of everything, but they also, like Andrew Berry, for example, who's now the Browns general manager, like he was just working in business. Like he wasn't really involved in football, but they want to be a place where they just bring smart people in and just coach them up in the business of football, but still use their foundation and leverage their their kind of core understanding of just business, and then apply it to this game. So it kind of goes both ways. Like you also want to see people who worked underneath people. You mentioned Kyle Shanahan. I've heard Parag Marathe in San Francisco is as good as it gets in terms of just running, like Jed York's entire operation. So you also kind of want to see people that work with those guys. Adam Peters is the big hot name in San Fran right now. But yeah, it is a challenge of, are they just kind of, along for the ride? Probably a little bit, too harsh in saying that. Or are they a difference maker in their own right that could bring some principles along with them? Yeah, it's the toughest part about trying to figure these things out.
Well, right, because I would say if I've worked with Kyle, I would pitch to another, like, look, Kyle knows exactly what he wants. I went and found it. And like, if we can get a coach in here who has that clarity, I can make sure that I go find the thing that he wants. And that's ultimately where it all comes together, which brings us to the next part of the conversation. Brad Spielberger with us from Pro Football Focus. And in your article, you paired, it wasn't always pairs, but you at least mentioned a couple of names as potential head coach candidates with all of these front office folks. And it wasn't just like, oh, I think this guy and this guy would be best friends. It was like, hey, they work together here at this time. There's familiarity. Like the head coaching side of it and the GM relationship, how important is that? And I guess obviously very important. That's a silly question. The better question is like, what makes that work versus often people know each other, work together, and then it doesn't work out.
It's a great point. And I will say, like, for better or for worse, I think you probably could argue maybe it's not the best thing, but if you're not paired, like they're like these auto pairings in their group, their joint, they kind of are in some instances. But anyway, like there's not always like, hey, this GM and this head coach are a package deal and they're going to come together. That does happen. But if not, still, you need to have these connections to people and have a coach that knows, hey, this guy's sharp. I can work with him. I think when you talk to guys that view themselves as potential general managers and the head coaches they'd like to work with, a lot of them are open to, hey, the coach may have final say on the direction we're going to go, the type of player and kind of player we're going to go after, and even in some instances, the specific target. But I want to be able to push back and say, okay, that's fine. Like, you are steering the ship. It's your team. But then I want the trust of, here's where we think his value is at. We can deviate a little bit. Like, we're not going to have a hard and fast, rule. But I want to be able to also have the power of, we're doing this together. You are steering the ship, but I am able to at times say, you know what? That doesn't work with the construct of what we're trying to do here. There are other responsibilities and other budgetary concerns that make that not tenable, and the coach has to be open to that. So it has to be a very, very good relationship. Like you said, not best friends, but super collaborative, and I think just open to like disagreeing, but being able to disagree, right? Where like you're going to disagree a ton. Can you navigate it? Can you work through it? Can there not be, you always hear this, like when you start to hear, oh, this is a GM's guy or this is the coach's guy, like about a player, multiple guys told me like that's the beginning of the end. Like as soon as you hear that in a building, it's like those guys are getting fired in a couple of years, because it's just like it can't be viewed that way. Every single person is our guy and is all, even if someone stood on the table for him more than the other. So yeah, it's just got to be a good level of trust and just appreciation for what each person does, even if you understand as a GM, the coach might be steering the ship.
Yeah, that just gave me just tremendous flashbacks to being on the beat and hearing about Jay Gruden, Bruce Allen disagreements on players. Lots of Jays guys, lots of. Oh, the GM loved him, and often they weren't even that good of players. But that's a different story. So you mentioned Eric Bieniemy quite a number of times in this piece as a potential head coach pairing for a number of GMs, whether it be here or elsewhere. What is Bieniemy's where is Bieniemy's stock around the league as a potential head coach candidate after this season, working with Sam Howell away from Mahomes and Reed, et cetera?
I think he's boosted it to a degree. I think people wanted to see, can he run an offense by himself? And he's done that. And look, is the offense perfect? No, but it's an unproven fifth-round pick quarterback that played one game last year, and there's been a lot of good there. Obviously the sack issues. We can talk about Sam Howell in a different light, but I think there's been good. Like the route combinations have led to a lot of successful downfield passing. There's good spacing in this offense. Sure, you could say maybe you'd like to run the ball a little bit more, and the balance isn't there. But the funny thing is, like, Bieniemy is a running backs coach at his core, and I think probably would agree with you. But probably, the defense is going to give up 30 points a game, so we need to score a lot. Or, I'm not making excuses for him, but I don't think people would view that split and say that he's going to refuse to, kind of go against that split and have a more balanced attack. If anything, he probably wants to, but just feels like he can't. So I think it's gone up this year. I do. And I think he's been able to work around some deficiencies on the offensive line. They do have good pass catchers, and maybe we'd want to see more production from a Terry McLaurin, from a Jahan Dotson, but you're also getting a lot more out of guys like a Byron Pringle and a Jamison Crowder. Curtis Samuel's popped off at times. Like, there's been a lot of positive, I think, to take from, for a first year with a fifth round sophomore quarterback. I would imagine his stock has increased a little bit underneath the shadow, or no longer underneath the shadow, of an Andy Reid.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see this offseason. I tend to think here they should just clean house and start over, but that doesn't mean that Eric shouldn't get a really great job somewhere else. Or if I was a head coach, I wouldn't want him as the OC, or I wouldn't interview him necessarily as an owner for a head coaching job. Last but not least, to kind of wrap up this conversation where we started, you mentioned Washington might be one of the best jobs on the market because of Josh Harris, new owner, who probably doesn't have new owner syndrome in the way some other new owners do because he actually owns other teams, and a litany of other factors. But I want to ask you about the roster. Is the roster seen as a positive here? Or is it just the fact that you could easily remake it with the cap space and the draft picks? Because I think that's been a large topic of conversation on our shows the last couple of weeks. Is I actually think the pendulum swung too far, that people think this roster is terrible. And I'm like, no, it's poorly coached. There's actually talent here. So what does the league say about that?
Yeah, I think it is both. I think there are foundational building block pieces. The interior defenders, of course. I mentioned the two receivers. You want more on the offensive line, but you have a bunch of, 5 top 100 draft picks now. Howell has at least done enough to, you could go into 2024 with him as the starter. Maybe he doesn't become the long-term guy, but you have an option, a guy that can play quarterback in the NFL. You're not like in Atlanta where it's like, okay, we know we don't have a guy. We need to figure that out. And then, the resources are plentiful. I mean, they basically didn't spend the last 2 years in free agency at all. And obviously extended internal guys, but aren't paying a ton of people. So I think it's both. There is young talent you can build around, and you actually have the resources to do so. And the owner thing is important too. Like, and the owner syndrome is a great point. Like, David Tepper in Carolina is doing David Tepper things in Carolina. Like,
yikes.
Yeah, like you. Yeah, go ahead.
I just said, yikes. I have no additional analysis here. Just full on yikes, bro.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is a belief that Harris is going to be hands-on at appropriate times, but hands-off when necessary, and let the football people do the football things. And that is, by the way, people always ask me, like, as a prospective GM or head coach, what do they care about the most? Is it cap space or talent on the roster or the quarterback? It's literally like, what owner am I working for, and how much is he going to meddle in what I'm doing? That is the number one answer 90% of the time.
Yeah, and the second thing is, how much is he going to pay me? And Josh Harris will pay people and leave them alone, and that is an amazing boss to work for. Brad Spielberger, Pro Football Focus. This was great, man. Let's definitely have you back sooner rather than later. Much appreciate the time. Great work on all your stuff at PFF site. Read them at pff.com. Brad, thank you, sir, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
This is The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.